As the global economic slowdown persists, more and more countries are turning to the International Monetary Fund for loans to help them deal with their economies. But the fund has faced criticism over the strict conditions and the interests that come with these loans. So let's bring into the conversation Attiya Waris. She is an Associate Professor of Fiscal Law and Policy at the University of Nairobi, to get you some analysis on the story. Attiya, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on to our program. Essentially, how much do we know, how much do we really know about government commitments that come with loans from the IMF?
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm also the UN independent expert on foreign debt, incidentally, at a global level. So we don't know very much, I think is the best answer. What we do know is that in the past, there have been a lot of loan conditionalities, and it wasn't ever quite clear what type of conditionalities were being put into these loan agreements. But more and more, what we are hearing is that it includes a lot of tax conditionalities. So less about how you're spending, more about how you're collecting. But with this new wave of austerity across the world, what we are starting to see is it seems to be a combination of both how spending is taking place as well as how collection is going to take place going forward.
There's also concern around, Attiya, and this might come as a surprise perhaps to our viewers, that it might have detrimental environmental impacts as well, as countries are sort of encouraged to move away from producing food to producing agricultural products to sell on global markets. So essentially, countries are forced in a way to move away from their own imperatives.
So one of the biggest concerns facing many developing countries is that, yes, they're not only agricultural economies, but they're also mineral-based economies.
Right.
And what is starting to happen is, as countries are trying to reconfigure how they're going to pay off debt in a situation where currency fluctuations sometimes mean that instead of paying what was 100% of a debt, it now hits 140% because of the lowering of value of a domestic currency. What you're starting to see is where countries had an opportunity to maybe go into more climate-friendly production, not mine certain minerals. Instead, there are many that are now starting to mine lithium. Others are mining other minerals more and more, not only because of the revenue from the mineral itself, but also because of the taxes that they're going to collect, with the effect in many parts of the developing world, of course, that there will be a climate repercussion.
Yeah. I understand as part of your work, Attiya, that you have focused in some ways on Argentina and on Pakistan. Why are they interesting examples to look at when it comes to talking about IMF debt?
So as you, an independent expert on foreign debt, I get to visit 2 countries a year. And the first country that I did visit last year was Argentina. I'm hoping to visit Pakistan next year, early next year, if not earlier. And the reason these 2 countries really struck me is, first, Argentina is the most indebted country in the world as we speak. But when you look at Argentina, you also assume it's an extremely profitable space. It's got a big economy. It's very visible on the international stage, but it is highly indebted. And it is a fascinating country to look at for one interesting reason. The currency has fluctuated repeatedly over the past 40 years. They have had cases where the currency completely broke down. They've had situations where their people moved from middle class into the lower classes. They've also had serious scenarios of failing to pay debt. They've had challenging governance in the country. But I was very struck because when I was there in August last year, when I landed in the morning, the rate of the peso to the dollar was about 240 pesos. And by evening, it was 280.
Wow.
And when you look at the value drop of that particular currency in the space of 8 or 9 hours, for that to happen, makes it an increasingly unstable country. And so what you have is poor people not being able to actually make their ends meet at the end of the month because of this constant fluctuation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the context of everything that you've just outlined, are there measures that we can hold the IMF to account? I mean, if we take a look at the contracts around IMF loans, are they clear enough so that we can say A, B, and C is what is problematic here?
Yes, in some scenarios, yes, they can. So this year, I wrote a letter to the IMF, actually to their executive director, Kristalina. And the reason I wrote to her is because 14 countries across the world, including Argentina and Pakistan, and I got very worried when I realized that Pakistan was now 1/3 underwater because of the flooding they had this year. So again, the climate connection is starting to show itself in many countries. And they have a particular clause in their contract that says that if they default on their loans, which frankly they're really moving in the direction where these 14 countries are going to default on their loans, potentially, that in 2025, the interest rate that was 1% is going to go up to 3%. So I find it a little bit odd that certain Latin American, African, and Asian countries are the only countries that have this particular clause, that there isn't a logic or a rationale as to why these 14 countries have it, because they're as different as Egypt and Angola and Zambia on the one hand, Argentina, and you cannot see the economic measure that has resulted in this particular clause being put into the agreement. And what really struck me was, how do you expect a country that's defaulting to suddenly be able to pay more 2 years later when it's already defaulting on the lower interest amount? And I think there are potential solutions. I think there needs to be more transparency in these agreements. They need to be publicly available. I think people in their countries should be able to see what kind of agreements their governments are negotiating on their behalf. And I also think that there needs to be a use of what I call fiscal legitimacy, transparency, accountability, responsibility. We need to see these agreements. We need to hold people accountable. We need to know who's responsible for negotiating them and why they were negotiated. But we also need to know how much a country has to pay. And one of the things that's really struck me as I've been looking at these agreements, the little that I have access to, is that every single regime pretty much goes back to the the debt holder, and says, oh, I'm really sorry, we've just come on board with a new government. We really can't afford to pay these loans. Can we have a loan extension? And so what you have is successive governments handing over the responsibility to subsequent governments, but taking the loan and benefiting from it in whichever way they see fit, in redistributing it or otherwise. And I think this lack of responsibility for a government that commits to a debt in actually starting that process of repaying it or being held to task for it, I think is one of the bigger problems that we're seeing. And that the IMF allows this, that the debtors allow these terms to extend beyond the life of those that are taking them on.
Yeah. It's very interesting because everything that you're outlining this morning, or at least some of the issues, the IMF have admitted to. They've admitted as much, to say that these are the gaps and this is how we need to address it. But of course, these are not new issues. And I just wonder whether there is a real will to do exactly what it says it wants to do, the IMF, that is.
I think that the IMF has a specific mandate. So it fulfills its mandate by what its board tells it to do. And then it is rolled out. And if we look at whether you're looking at a one-man organization or one-woman organization, you're looking at something that's like 100 people working or 1,000. At the end of the day, the vision comes from a specific space, and its ability to do things comes from the documents that created it, right? Its mandate. And I don't believe that IMF or the World Bank can actually cover a lot of these issues, which I think is why Nigeria has actually asked the General Assembly to consider, and this is probably the second or the third time this is happening from different parts of the world, to consider the creation of a global tax or fiscal body where you can take these sort of debates and discussions and have them handled. So there are some mechanisms found within the IMF or the World Bank, for example. There are mechanisms found within the regional banks, the BRIC Bank as well. But there isn't one that will allow us to look at it from a holistic and global perspective. And I think we're overdue the creation of a global fiscal or tax body, which is what's being debated at the General Assembly this year.
Absolutely. Attiya Waris, let me thank you for your time this morning. She is an Associate Professor of Fiscal Law and Policy at the University of Nairobi, also a global expert on foreign debt.